All right, everyone. Then I'm very thrilled to be here with an honored guest, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, who is a professor at the University of South Florida College of Medicine and gives courses in pharmacology and physiology, and doing a lot of interesting research in some really interesting topics like cancer, seizures, Alzheimer's, and how all they relate to the ketogenic diet, which is the core of our discussion today. So, first of all, Dominic, welcome, and thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Adol.
So, first of all, I have to ask you this. I read somewhere that you have an IQ of, I think, 145. Is that true?
I don't know where you read that, but is it true? Maybe. I don't know. I think when I was in college, we did those testing when I was in neuroscience. So it might be around there, but I would say it's not true because it's probably not that now. I don't know. Whenever I did that, it was probably at least a decade ago or 2 decades ago. So I think people have different, their intelligence varies depending on their skills, and I don't really trust IQ tests. So if mine's high, I definitely don't trust it.
All right. It really seems like you have some kind of a passion for health and being healthy even as an individual. Is it something that, originates from your teenage years even, or you just came to appreciate this later on?
I think it evolved over time. As I was when I played football, peewee football, and then high school football, I think there was just an underlying desire to improve myself physically more so than academically. So I think I put a disproportionate amount of time and effort into kind of understanding, my biology, my physiology, and trying to improve upon that. And when I was in high school, actually, I wasn't a very good student, so I probably put most of my time, into training, weight training, and sports. And I think it just evolved out of that. I got a lot of self-gratification from that, and just a lot of, because I wasn't good in school, I put my effort into understanding my body and how to improve my strength and performance.
Right. Okay. Would you describe what you do in your daily job and what you did like several years ago when you came across the ketogenic diet?
Yeah. Nowadays it depends on what day it is. If it's a day that I'm teaching, I'm just coming from a faculty meeting now. But as far as it relates to the diet, my study of the diet, we have probably about 5 projects all running in parallel. And we have a number of PhD students in the lab, undergraduates, postdoctoral fellows, and they're all assigned a different primary project. And they're doing research on the project. As a principal investigator, I'm overseeing the project and kind of determining how it should be done and making sure things are done a particular way. So it's really a fun job in that, the students, and I was one once, PhD student, are really in the trenches doing, the bench work. And I get to, at this point in my career, I get to oversee a lot of this and sometimes actually, work with them depending on what's being done. So I get to oversee a lot of projects with data coming out related to not just the ketogenic diet, but we look at ketone supplementation, metabolic therapies in general. So, diets, supplementation, and from a wide range of things, from cancer to seizures to wound healing, neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's disease. So, I could talk about any one of those all day. It's, we have a lot of things going on from pretty broad perspective, all based on metabolism.
Right. Okay.
So that research is going on, and it involves, and as the data is collected, we have periodic lab meetings to discuss the data, particular projects. Certain, lab members will present the data, discuss the implications.
Right. Okay. So nutritional ketosis, for those who don't know, is process by which the brain and our cells are obtaining energy from ketone bodies, which are derived from dietary fat, essentially. Is that a fair simplification, or things need to be added?
Yeah, that's right. I like to think about, nutritional ketosis occurs more or less by the suppression of insulin. So restricting dietary carbohydrates and restricting protein to a degree, and even overall calories uh, will decrease the amount of insulin that's secreted, and you will over time deplete your stored carbohydrate in the form of glycogen. So if insulin is kept low and glycogen stores are depleted, there will be a mobilization of free fatty acids, and your body will be switching over to this form of fuel. And as blood glucose gets lower, the brain lacks a metabolic substrate in the form of glucose. So, this is probably the underlying, reason for hepatic ketogenesis, to supply a high energy metabolic substrate to the brain when glycogen stores are depleted. So I think from a neuroscience perspective, that's one of the main functions of ketosis. It's just the oxidation of fatty acids in the liver. And there's so much oxidation of fatty acids, there's an accumulation of acetyl-CoA, and that condenses to acetoacetate, which is a ketone body. It gets converted to beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is one of the main ketone bodies that we measure in our blood. And both acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate are very potent metabolic substrates that can be a great source of fuel for peripheral tissues, including the heart and the brain and the muscles.
Okay. So, I've heard you mentioning metabolic health a lot previously. And so what is metabolic health in your definition, and when is it really achieved, if that's not too, vague of a question?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad, term there. So I view metabolic health as just a reflection of your metabolic physiology, and that can include a number of things, but I would put top of the list, I would put blood glucose. If you're running blood glucose levels in the high hundreds or 200s, that's not good metabolic health. That glucose is really toxic. So the top ones that I can, the ones that I like to look at and hold most important are probably glucose, triglycerides, HDL, and although it's not really linked directly to metabolism, which would be markers of inflammation, probably the most general one is C-reactive protein. And that, just those, four that I mentioned there, that gives you a pretty good snapshot of what's going on from your metabolic physiology. And these are the things that, interestingly improve dramatically with a carbohydrate restricted diet. These markers go in the positive direction, and there's an overall improvement in lipid profile in most people with a high fat, low carb diet. So I would put glucose at the top of the list there, because and insulin too. So I usually, when people who have the means, really want to self-experiment and track their metabolic health, I ask them to measure their insulin levels. And with a carbohydrate restricted diet, even if it's isocaloric, their insulin levels go down. And it's really that suppression of insulin that drives hepatic ketogenesis. And with insulin, obviously it's your main glucose transport hormone, but it has so many other effects. So keeping insulin low has profound effect on your physiology, and I think your long-term health too. So there's a lot of markers of inflammation that will go down if you suppress insulin. Insulin dephosphorylates HMG-CoA reductase, which is a target for the statin drugs. So paradoxically, with a high-fat diet, you'll see an improvement in cholesterol levels. Not in everyone, but a lot of times that's the case.
Okay, so that's pretty much sums it up why the average, non-Navy SEAL diver, non-cancer diagnosed patient should be interested in this nutritional approach in the first place.
Yeah, I don't think the ketogenic diet is for everyone, and I know quite a few people, actually athletes, that do really well with carbohydrate-based diet. They tend to be, the subset of population that can really match their appetite to their energy expenditure output, and they generally have good metabolic health. But I think for a large percentage of the population are relatively sedentary. I would put me in that group. I'm actually a pretty sedentary person and just kind of sit and work all day. I try to work out when I can, but so I'm really not burning off a lot of glucose, a lot of glycogen. So if my glycogen stores are topped off and I'm taking in surplus calories in the form of carbohydrates, that's going to elevate blood glucose and insulin, which can be pro-inflammatory and negatively affect my overall metabolic profile in a way. And that's really that's metabolic syndrome, right? So that's what we see here in the US. A lot of people have problems associated with, just essentially surplus calories, right? They've just put on some extra weight with age, and they're have reduced insulin sensitivity, and this can create a host of problems, including the onset of more age-related neurodegenerative diseases. So a lot of this can be fixed, especially type 2 diabetes could probably put someone into remission with a low carb ketogenic diet. We just have Jeff Volek here. I hosted Jeff Volek at my university, and he gave a really compelling talk that just shows, he went down the list on a variety of different diseases and how powerful, carbohydrate. He doesn't call it the ketogenic diet, right? He calls it in his books carbohydrate restriction or low carb diets. But he just, the data that he has, and just the list of different things, so many, pretty much every disorder can be influenced in some way by altering your metabolism. So carbohydrate restriction really causes profound changes in your physiology that can promote healing or the metabolic management of a particular disorder, like seizures or cancer, for example.
Okay, so how might the average Joe approach this whole thing in the wrong way, or apply it in the wrong way?
In the wrong way, yeah. Well, I guess you have to ask what your goals are, right? So when I was younger, my goal was to put on as much size and strength as possible. To be honest, I was really just into powerlifting, and a carbohydrate restricted diet would probably be counterproductive for that goal, because you do need some amount of insulin and some amount of carbohydrate surplus to really optimize size and strength. But that's not really a health goal. So if someone is, or performance goal as it pertains to endurance, maybe, carbohydrates are more likely linked to performance with anaerobic exercise, like weightlifting. But when it comes to aerobic exercise, the new data that's emerging, shows that a low carb, high fat diet can enhance athletic performance in, for example, like triathletes and ultra endurance runners. So if someone's, goal was to perform better and to stay healthy in that realm, then approaching, their diet from a high fat, low carb perspective could be better. And Jeff Volek has, written books on this pretty extensively. Essentially what it does when your body's fat adapted and you engage in prolonged exercise, you're shifting your body to a fatty acid and ketone metabolism and sparing glucose. And if you can spare muscle glycogen and liver glycogen, you can run farther, and if you're, oxidizing more fat for fuel. And this can easily be shown just looking at, the respiratory quotient and and the exercise studies show that you're oxidizing proportionally more fat once you're on the diet. And I think in general, shifting your body to more of a fat-based metabolism is really, if you're familiar with the term hormesis, like mitochondrial hormesis, so you're really stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis, mitochondrial efficiency. And, there's a number of studies, usually the calorie restriction studies, you can point to them, but there's studies just that directly use ketone bodies or ketogenic diets or, ketogenic precursors that show enhancement of metabolism from the fundamental level, from the mitochondria. So if someone, just getting back to your question, really, wants to implement this, they should just learn as much as possible. And what I encourage is self-experimentation. Start out with a book like The Art and Science of Low Carb Performance or The Art and Science of Low Carb Living, and follow the general guidelines in there and monitor blood glucose and blood ketones, and in particular monitor those metabolic biomarkers in response to eating a meal and response to exercise and just response to your daily routine. And you'll get a handle on what your carbohydrate threshold is and what that threshold needs to be to get into sustained nutritional ketosis. And the benefit of being in ketosis, as opposed to just following like a low carb diet that might be higher in protein, the benefit of being in ketosis is that the ketones tend to dampen and control appetite in a way, but they also, I believe, provide a neurological benefit, as far as feeding your brain a high energy metabolite. So your thinking tends to be more clear, and you have, if it's a low carb diet that's just high in protein and not high enough in fat, you're not making the ketones, and you tend to get more hungry during the day. And I ran into that problem initially. So the big problem a lot of people may have is really too much protein, because their blood glucose will fluctuate throughout the day, and their ketone, they'll be going in and out of ketosis, and they really won't be experiencing, a lot of the benefits that I like to talk about, which is kind of appetite suppression. Elevation of ketone bodies is also very protein sparing. So when you eat a really high protein diet, you're also oxidizing more protein for energy. So your body's on this protein cycle, right? You're breaking down protein, eating protein. So if you decrease your protein and add more fat, the fat and the elevation of ketone bodies is actually pretty anti-catabolic. So, it might not happen immediately, but over time, I found that I can eat about a third of the protein that I used to eat.
Which is, number-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I used to eat probably in excess of 400 grams of protein a day, and I did that for many years. And now I probably get somewhere around 150 grams a day, and some days less than 100. If I'm inactive, but on the days that I'm a little more active or whatever, I can usually hit somewhere between 100 and 150.
Okay. So if you were to travel back in time and meet the 25-year-old Dominic who is really into powerlifting and athletic performance, so given the same goals and pursuits, what nutritional guidance would you give him?
Oh, if I could give guidance to, if I went back like 20 years, I would, what I realize now in hindsight, which is 2020, right, is that the protein that I was consuming and the protein that I thought I needed to consume was far higher than what I actually needed to consume. And also my meal frequency. So I thought that it was necessary to eat 6 or 7 meals a day, and I thought I thought this was critical for gaining size and strength and in just overall optimizing my performance. But I found that that's not true. I think the clear data show that that's not true. So one of the benefits of eating a a high fat, lower carb diet is that you can dramatically reduce meal frequency. So when I was eating, 6 or 7 meals a day, I would get anxiety because I was missing a meal. If I was in a situation where 3, 4, 5 hours went by and I wasn't able to eat a meal, that that was like a stress to me, and I was constantly, carrying food preparation, food timing, cleanup of food. It was just I was preoccupied with food, and now it's been very liberating eating this pattern of eating, which is high protein or high fat, moderate protein, low carb, and carbs mostly from fiber, has a very satiating effect on me. So I eat in the morning and then I eat at night. And then during the day, right now I'm drinking coffee with butter in it and some MCT oil. And that's more than enough to sustain me throughout the day. So I find that very liberating that I have 2 sit-down meals that are social. I can basically eat until I'm comfortable and full. And I don't have to eat all these little meals throughout the day or be preoccupied with food because I'm hungry or because I think that it's important practical advantage to this pattern of eating for me.
I think this is a pretty good segue to talk a little bit about the role of calories. I've heard an interview which you did with Dr. Mercola, I think like 6 months ago, and back then you really seemed to be a big proponent of calorie restriction, and then I kind of seen you switching gears on it a little bit. What is your take on it right now?
Yeah, well, the Mercola article was kind of focused on cancer prevention, cancer treatment. And I think in that context, I do emphasize calorie restriction. I think it's important for the metabolic management of something like cancer, unless you're underweight. If someone has a BMI of, 19 or 20, I wouldn't advise a calorie restriction. I would advise carbohydrate restriction. When it comes to performance, I guess the real question is, what are your goals? If your goal is athletic performance, I would suggest try to get as much calories in as possible, really, to sustain your athletic performance. And I think that's important. Without, if you want to gain 5 pounds of muscle, then you're going to have to increase your calories. I would advise increasing it in the form of fat and just, a little bit of protein, and just titrate in the protein if necessary, but typically not going above 1.5 grams per kilogram. I found that I can grow on that. If I need to, I can just maintain that amount of protein and add more calories and fat, and I can start to gain muscle. I like my body weight now is like 225, and I don't want to go up or down. So I just basically eat to sustain my body weight and strength right now. But if I wanted to, for example, gain like 10 pounds of muscle, I would just add calories in the form of the ratios that I'm eating now. I would just eat more of the same food I'm eating now in the same ratios. So if I wanted to, sometimes, like when I'm traveling, I kind of like to calorie restrict. So instead of eating 2 meals a day, I'll eat 1 meal a day. But the meal may actually have some carbohydrates. So when I was traveling in Europe or other places, I tend to like not eat throughout the day, but have a really nice sit-down dinner at night. And because I'm in an environment where I want to appreciate the culture of the food, I may allow myself to eat some carbohydrates or more carbohydrates than normal. So it kind of depends on your goals. But as far as calorie restriction, I definitely think there are some benefits from it. And I think people who have a genetic predisposition to be overweight, they should really focus on an eating strategy that allows them to feasibly implement some form of calorie restriction. Obviously that in my mind, it's carbohydrate restriction. Some people like to do intermittent fasting, which is, 1 meal a day sort of thing. And I get a lot of feedback from people who have developed different strategies, for doing this. And, if someone tries to do calorie restriction with a high carbohydrate diet, they tend to just be hungry all the time. Whereas the advantage of the ketogenic diet is that, and many people have told me this once they've adapted to using this, is that they actually have mental energy, and they're not just constantly preoccupied with thinking when can they eat their next meal. So from a practical advantage, that's really, if someone wanted to do calorie restriction, because there are a lot of folks out there, that feel calorie restriction is really the key to health, right? I think Mercola is one of them, and Ron Rosedale, his mentor, is, written extensively about protein restriction and calorie restriction. There's definitely some truth to that, but I think a lot of people take it overboard. I think the animal studies are really compelling and really clear, but as a guy who does animal research, I can tell you, when you take a mouse and restrict calories 25%, you see, the mouse, improves in many ways. It lives longer, it's faster, it's mice fed an ad libitum diet, which basically describes all animal research. The mice are really overeating. So when you restrict their calories 25%, you're removing a toxin from their system. So mice are basically eating themselves sick, mice that are fed an ad libitum diet. So when you cut their calories by 25%, it restores their normal health, I would say, because a mouse in the wild needs to forage. Food availability isn't always a sure thing. So it's running around trying to get its food, for one thing. And so the mice studies, which are always referenced with these the benefits of calorie restriction, are very compelling. The non-human primate studies show that there's not an extension of life, but there's a dramatic delay in the early onset of chronic diseases, which is pretty compelling. So, a lot of people are practicing this calorie restriction. I think it's kind of premature, but I think one can say that if you consistently feed yourself surplus calories in the form of any macronutrient, you're going to cause metabolic derangement that will, spark will stimulate your body in many negative ways, chronic inflammation, early onset of chronic diseases and such.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, because this health community is really just divided into two groups, like one of them with, Dave Asprey and Gary Taubes just saying that calories just don't matter whatsoever, and the other group with, like other people say that it's all about energy balance, but it seems pretty much like the truth lays somewhere in between.
Well, I think the body is a good index of what you should do. So, staying as lean as possible and having as much muscle as possible is great. And if you can do that on a high amount of calories, I would say you're gaining more benefit than the guy who's calorie restricted and has a higher percentage of body fat and less lean body mass. So look at bodybuilders, for example. I mean, exercise produces a calorie restriction effect, right? And, by lifting weights, you're building metabolically active tissue in the form of skeletal muscle. So you're basically, stockpiling a reserve of metabolic tissue that improves your overall metabolic profile, because you're enhancing glucose disposal. You're elevating a tissue that's basically allowing you to dispose of glucose. And I think that has a calorie restriction effect in and of itself. So if you have proportionally more lean body mass in the form of muscle, that can allow you to eat an enormous amount of calories and not have negative consequences. So, Gary Taubes comes at it from the angle that suppressing insulin will produce a calorie restriction effect, and there's some truth to that. I don't think, I think he glosses over a lot of the details, but I think his books are generally helpful. I think Gary's a really smart guy, and he's contributed a lot to getting the information out there that low carbohydrate diet is a really great way to restore metabolic health and control your body weight and body fat. but there's more to the story, I think. And I think Gary actually he doesn't like to exercise much, or is not like a big proponent of exercise.
Yeah,
That's what everyone says. And I've talked to him, and I met him. He's he looks like he works out. It seems like he has some appreciation for exercise, at least.
Yeah.
So yeah, the strategy, really needs to take in consideration the person's goals, the person's genetics, the person's, overall lifestyle. But if you're using calorie restriction to extend your life or get a lot of benefits, I think that in humans, the data is kind of lacking on really forcing yourself to calorie restrict is not. There's a book that I have in my office. It's called, it's the starvation studies that were done by Ansel Keys. And more recently, there was a book written by Todd Tucker, The Great Starvation Experiment, that was done in Minnesota and or Michigan, right? Michigan or Minnesota. It's a really good graphic demonstration of how calorie restriction can really screw up your physiology. And I think it serves as a warning. I think people that are really trying to calorie restrict, it can have a major negative impact on your hormones. Some people may call it metabolic damage, but I'll call it metabolic adaptation, where your body's set point is readjusted, to balance, its homeostasis to the amount of energy you're giving it. And I don't think the data is clear that doing this extreme form of calorie restriction is going to, result in significant extension of life or delaying chronic diseases. I think more modest calorie restriction or just simply exercise and carbohydrate restriction can achieve the same end goal, right? Which is healthy aging. So we want to age healthy with as much lean body mass as possible. To preserve our metabolic health and to maintain our function.
All right. Here is another question for you, which you might be able to answer. I'm pretty much following an ultra low carb diet. The protein is fairly high, but it's a very high fat diet, in fact. And I don't really get hungry. I can go a really long period of time without eating. But past a certain point, as the feeding time approaches, I can just get very, very, irritable and easily annoyed and sensitive, and I'm just not a very fun person to be around. Is this an indication that my brain is no longer utilizing ketone bodies efficiently?
That makes sense. Yeah, you're experiencing signs of mild hypoglycemia, and your brain is craving glucose, it's craving energy, and when I get towards the end of the day, when it's been 10 hours after I last ate or longer, that's when I start to feel the most energy. So I get the most energy when my body is really hungry, because I'm really starting to pull off my fat stores, and I'm really generating more ketones later in the day, a few hours prior to eating my evening meal. And I've always kind of been like that anyway. I'm not really a morning person, but even if I do workouts, I try to do it later in the day. From your perspective, protein does have a satiating effect too. So you might be, but it's kind of a short-lived satiating effect. So it impacts blood glucose, but the glucose elevation profile is more protracted than if you ate carbohydrates, typically. So from your perspective, I always encourage self-experimentation. So you might try to lower the protein a little bit and just maybe add more fat and just see how your body reacts. And occasionally you come across people who just cannot tolerate like a high fat diet, especially athletes that have a really high caloric requirement. When they try to transition to these high fat diets, their digestive system, they just really can't handle all the fat. So maybe a more, I don't really like the term, but like paleo type diet is more in their realm. And generally speaking, I think for the average person, a diet that has 50 to 100 grams of carbs in it, for someone who's active, would be optimal, like just kind of under 100 grams. And to bump in and out of nutritional ketosis occasionally, because I think you can derive from some benefits out of it. But typically, staying in ketosis all the time is just not very feasible for most people. I do it because it's my field of research, so I'm always in usually some level of ketosis, but I break it from time to time if I go out to eat and just want to break it, and I don't really have any issues doing that. I get a little bit, if I go out to dinner and I overconsume protein or have some bread or carbs, the next morning I wake up a little bit earlier than normal, and I wake up real hungry, probably because my body dumped a lot of insulin, and my glucose went down. So I wake up kind of hungry just because my body dumped a lot of insulin if I go out to dinner at night, for example. So if you're not already doing it, monitor your ketone levels, whether urine or blood, and monitor your blood glucose so you get a handle on your physiology and how it responds to what you feed it. And I think a simple glucometer is really one of the most efficient tools for understanding how your body reacts to food. So I encourage everyone to get that. A relatively cheap thing. A blood ketone meter is a little more expensive, but you could start out with a urine ketone strips. And then once you're in ketosis, with the urine strips, then it might be worth investing into blood ketone strips to get a better handle, to fine tune a level of ketosis that you feel is optimal for you.
Okay, so Dom, I know you have to go very soon, but I would be just very curious, as a guy who is obviously super busy and pretty fit, in fact, how does a typical day look like for you these days?
Well, I think I have to say that my days, one thing about my job is that it varies from day to day. Like one day I could be traveling and presenting in Europe or meeting with a collaborator somewhere. So today may not be a typical day, but I'll wake up and relatively early and kind of I down some branch chain amino acid formulas as soon as I wake up. So I typically get some aminos when I wake up while I'm brewing my coffee, and I'll brew a pretty strong cup of coffee. I'll put about 1/3 of a stick of butter in it, and then I'll work typically on a manuscript, or if I have some important emails, I like to get them out of the way first thing, and I'll just work kind of before work hours for a good 2 hours. And that's, my thinking is very clear when I wake up. I don't have the distractions of the day kind of weighing me down. So I'll get 2 hours of kind of work done out of the way, and then I'll eat my first meal, which will typically be anywhere from 4 to 6 whole eggs, and in addition to that, I usually have some kind of meat like bacon or fish like sardines. I had oysters this morning. I like to add oysters in once they're a great source of nutrition, chicken or beef or whatever, but always eggs and some form of supplemental protein. And then some kind of green vegetable like asparagus, broccoli. Typically I put some cheese on it or cook it in olive oil or a little bit of coconut oil. So I eat a breakfast that's kind of heavy and it sustains me throughout the day. And I usually like to kind of go to my lab and see where all my students are in their research projects. I got now I have 4 PhD students, a postdoc, a lab manager, a bunch of enthusiastic undergrads. So it's kind of getting a handle on what they're doing, making sure I'm fulfilling my role as a mentor to keep them on track on where they need to be for their career goals and whatnot. And then it's usually, back to my office for conference calls or faculty meetings or committee meetings. My position and a tenure track faculty position requires a lot of things that aren't directly related to my research, which can slow research down. So I try to limit those things. I try to limit my teaching. I enjoy it, but sometimes, the more I teach and the more committees and things that I'm on, the more it kind of takes away from my research, which I would like to prioritize. It would be great, to be in a position where all I had to do was research. I would love to do that, but I do find teaching very rewarding. And one of the classes that I teach is advanced metabolism advanced metabolism and signaling. And that class, what I like to do is I collect a lot of papers over time that I really want to read. And in that class, I can distribute them among students in the class and have them present them. So the students actually help me, it's more of a journal club, get caught up on the literature. So for example, one student will be presenting a particular paper and all the other students will have to write a review of that paper. You know, the paper will be given 1 week prior to the class. So it fills me in on the particular study, and I like to hear the students' critique of the particular study. That's usually relevant to the research that I'm doing. So that's a fun class, but I teach a wide range of different classes. So we have a lot of equipment in the lab that requires, I guess more or less you could say, a lot of troubleshooting and maybe a high level of expertise to be able to use some of the equipment in the lab. So a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the time that I spend in the lab is actually kind of building equipment and building tools that allow us to answer questions. For example, you know, I'm funded by the Office of Navy Research to understand how the brain responds to high pressure of oxygen. So we needed to build specialized equipment to study, you know, the physiology under high levels of oxygen, or cells, or even down to the level of the mitochondria, and actually looking at mitochondria in brain cells under high pressures of oxygen, seeing what's going on there. So building these tools, keeping them operational, and improving their performance is also something that we do. The most exciting thing that we're doing now is really developing metabolic therapies in the form of ketone supplementation or metabolic substrates that can be used as more or less alternative fuels that can fuel the brain metabolism under periods of stress, can enhance brain metabolism under environmental extremes, whether it be, you know, psychological, low oxygen, high altitude, that sort of thing. Because that's a real problem for the warfighter, you know, that who's at altitude in the mountains. You know, if the oxygen concentration drops, you know, cognitive performance goes down, you get a host of physiological problems. So developing countermeasures against that is something that our lab is really, you know, interested in. And in the process of doing that, we find that, you know, these countermeasures have implications for a wide range of things, even cancer.
Okay, so as a final question, would you give 3 advices or 3 tips to people like us, you know, in their early 20s to get the max out of our careers?
I would tell, you know, first and foremost, to really follow your passion. Whatever you're passionate about is what you're going to be successful in. So if you're, you know, you can make money in something that you don't like, but you're not going to be passionate about it, and ultimately it's not going to be fulfilling for you. So I tell my students, you know, to really follow their passion, and whatever that may be, as long as it provides a service. You know, you can make a lot of money doing something and it won't be fulfilling because you're not providing a service to another person. Whenever you're in a position where your occupation is providing a valuable service, that is tremendously rewarding. Another thing would be, I mean, for me, is really put yourself out of your comfort zone. Go out of your way to put yourself out of, you know, into an uncomfortable situation. So I think this is really important. It was important for me. My mentor, I had a tremendous fear of public speaking. So when I entered the PhD program, my mentor sent me to New Zealand, you know, to give a keynote talk somewhere because she couldn't do it. And I was terrified. So she was always pushing me out into to an environment that she knew I was extremely uncomfortable being in. And I you know, I kind of hated her for it, but that was probably the best thing that she could have ever done. So when I have students working under me, you know, I try to identify not really their weaknesses, and I don't want to push them into something that's not going to be helpful for them, but I think it's really important to nudge them. And everyone's different in how they should be nudged, but they need to be nudged into an area that can get them out of their comfort zone, because then, you can really identify some really important qualities in people. It really brings out the best in most people. I think there needs to be a way that you have to go about doing it, but I think it's really important for people to just put themselves out of their comfort zone, because once we're comfortable, we tend, to lack passion and the persistence that's needed to be successful. And I think, you asked for three things. The third is just to take a step back and give yourself creative downtime. No matter how busy I get, I try to just like completely shut down and just, take my dog for a walk, at night, and just sit down and stare at the stars and just completely, turn off everything. I think that's really important. I call it creative downtime, and people have different, it could be meditation or whatever. But I try to view life, kind of body, mind, and spirit. So I take physical health really important. My mental health is really important. And my spiritual health, is really important too. So I think just that balance between, work, your friends and family, interpersonal relationships are key. And your own physical health is important. So you can't be optimal in other areas of your life if your own physiology is not optimized. So I think that's important. To balance is really important. It's easier said than done, but I think that would be my third is sort of view life, body, mind, and spirit, and that you have this creative downtime to allow that to happen.
Please give a short plug for your website and where people can find you.
I don't really sell anything, but I compile a lot of information that I think would be helpful for people who are interested in metabolic therapies for the management of disorders like seizures or cancer and things. And I developing a website is on my list of to-dos, but the website that I have up now is ketonutrition.org. And on that website, I've listed probably a dozen or more podcasts. I put articles on there that are more like open access articles, so it's kind of free journal articles about ketogenic diets as it relates to cancer, seizures, or whatever. And I have doctors on there, that are kind of familiar with this technique. So yeah, that would be kind of like the only plug I have is just the website where I'm compiling this information. And in the next couple months, I'm going to develop it in a way that can, be more helpful to people. So yeah, that's my single plug for the day.
Okay, Dominic, I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me, Abel. Yeah, and just I'd be interested in doing another one. I mean, my time was a little pressed today, but yeah, if you ever want to do a follow-up, usually I've done a lot of podcasts with different people, and once I get off, they'll email me, and it's like, oh, this, these questions or your answers really sparked so many more questions, and we need to do a follow-up. So.